kind of back talking about this interview with Paula Woodward. We were talking about Patsy Ramsey's behavior and John Ramsey's behavior and how it's a little bit weird and it kind of throws you off. And there's no genuine behavior coming from John. He's just on his mark. He's just repeating himself, going from there. And you really don't get a real story. And the fact that these guys can go to the news and give the news free reign of their time. But when the cops ask for free reign of their time to ask any question, they don't want to go. They don't want to talk about anything. So what I'm really looking for is to understand more about the thought process of Paula from a very early time frame as she relates to the Ramseys, because now she's with John Ramsey all the time. And it's crazy to me. So let's get going.
We're never going to convince cynics of, of the truth, so we don't try to. What we're trying to do is solicit help from the public to find this creature and to beg the Colorado officials to be at least objective and open enough to listen when that tip comes through. Then we'll find this person.
What's going on with this hatred and obsession and fringe?
I don't know. What we've learned through all this, we've come out of this realizing there are a lot of good people in the world. We've had wonderful people come forward and support us from all over the world. And even though you'd think that we would come out of this being hateful and want to go to a mountain retreat and fence ourselves off from the world, we realize there are some wonderful, good people in the world. But we also realize that there's some very fundamentally evil, bad people in the world. That's a fact. We were naive about that, but it exists. There are more good people than bad, but the bad exists. And we're never going to change that. And we're not trying to
find this person. And there will be people who watch this and say, as you say that, we want to find the killer. They'll say, well, you are the killer.
You know,
look. We're never going to convince cynics of the truth, so we don't try to. What we're trying to do is solicit help from the public to find this creature and to beg the Colorado officials to be at least objective and open enough to listen when that tip comes through. Then we'll find this person.
Yep.
What's going on with this hatred and obsession and fringe?
I don't know. What we've learned through all this, we've come out of this realizing there are a lot of good people in the world. We've had wonderful people come forward and support us from all over the world. And even though you'd think that we would come out of this being hateful and want to go to a mountain retreat and fence ourselves off from the world, we realize there are some wonderful, good people in the world. But we also realize that there's some very fundamentally evil, bad people in the world. That's a fact. We were naive about that, but it exists. There are more good people than bad, but the bad exists. And we're never going to change that. And we're not trying to convince the bad people and the cynics and the hateful people that we loved our daughter and that we didn't kill her. We're trying to appeal to the good people and say, let's find this evil creature that's among us and put him away, because this person will kill another child.
Do you want him to contact you?
I would be desperate for a contact. At a minimum, please leave. You've done a crime that has captured world attention. Please tell somebody about it.
Why?
Because ultimately, we want to know who you are.
And why does that person care what you think?
That person, I'm sure, doesn't care what we think at all. I'm sure that person, we've been told that person was either very angry at me or was very jealous of me personally, and that's a heavy burden for me to carry.
I think one thing that, as I'm looking and listening to what John is saying, I think one thing that stands out to me is the way that John sort of begins. I was having trouble with this. You know, his phrase, he begins with his response with the phrase, please leave. When she's asking him, what would you say? Like, what would you say to the to the killer? And John says, please leave. And then he abruptly changes direction. And so when he shifts like that, I'm kind of reminded of the structural pattern of the ransom note, because the note initially says Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, as if the writer is intending to try to address both John and Patsy. Yet, nothing that follows actually engages both of them at all. They don't, he doesn't, he starts off by saying, Dear Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey. That's what the first note was going to be. And then it just quickly pivots. You don't have anything to write. You don't write anything. You don't start anything. But somehow, some way you had an idea to talk to both Patsy and John. But then all of a sudden you said, you know what? I'll just talk to John. Okay. So nothing follows. And then they quickly pivot to addressing John alone, saying, Mr. Ramsey. And then they continue almost entirely in that direction, meaning that, you know, they had something to say to John initially. I don't know why they even brought Patsy into this. Right. And so that concerns me because, like, if we think about John's answer when he says, please leave, John's answer seems to begin with one line of thought and then sort of redirects midstream. Please leave. What would you say? Please leave. And then he just pivots into something different. And you're like, why would you say, please leave? And I think what makes this puzzling to me is that the ransom note also appears uncertain about its own focus. We've looked at the ransom note up and down, but the more, and I really feel like I don't have anything to say about the ransom note, or I often feel like I can't break down the ransom note as good as other people have. Or like, that's not my passion. I'm not saying that I can. Maybe I can, but that's not my passion because I just feel like I don't derive much from the ransom note. But just kind of looking at it now, what makes it puzzling when we think about the ransom note is that the ransom note also appears uncertain in its own focus because JonBenet is the center of this crime, right? As I say, we get on these talk shows and you don't even talk about JonBenet. You barely even talk about the investigation. You more so talk about how people are persecuting you. And JonBenet herself is never really mentioned by name, even though she's the central target of this crime. And so the writer of the ransom note is trying to claim to not have a personal problem with John. You know, if you mess with my daughter, that's personal. What do you think I'm going to take that personal every time? That's a personal problem. So he's claiming not to have a personal problem with John or John's business, but instead he frames his grievances as being against the United States. And if you sort of suggest that the United States is, so now the United States is a target that we should be looking for. Right. And so if the United States is the problem, then this would suggest that we are looking at an institutional or a political motive. Right. Completely different from what John Douglas is saying when he says, oh, you know, this is personal. This person may not even have known you, John, but they had something personal against you for whatever reason. And if you address the United States as the problem, then now we're looking at a motive that it's like we're looking at a wider institution or some sort of political narrative, right? That's how the note is framed. It's framed as a political narrative at first. Yet in other parts of the note, it becomes oddly personal, referring to John as a fat cat, invoking good Southern common sense, and sort of even making indirect references that seem connected to Patsy's Southern background rather than John. I know a lot of times we look at this and we say the person didn't know John well enough. If they would have known him, they wouldn't have said, use your good Southern common sense. They would have known that he was from the North. He was from Michigan. Okay. But my thing is, what if good Southern common sense was put in there by mistake? What if good Southern common sense is actually referring to Patsy? Because Patsy would have the Southern common sense. And so while I'm trying to write a letter to John, I get confused and I weave both of them in some way, shape, or form. And I say, John, you're a fat cat because that's associated with money. But Patsy, use your good common sense because that's associated with the Southern part of Patsy. And so while I am writing to John, I write something completely in left field that has nothing at all to do with John. And you're like, why would you write that? What would be the purpose of calling him a Southerner? Why would you write that? Where would that come from? You're talking about, your business. I understand your business and your ties to the United States. But all of a sudden, in left field, and then we get to, because we're talking about the United States at first, but then we get to talking about how much money John has. And it's like, I thought you had a problem with the United States. You didn't even have a problem with his business. You had a problem with the United States. And we get all the way down to where you're now antagonizing him for Southern common sense. You didn't even have to say Southern. And that's why when we look at the letter and we say, what's the point of this letter? What's the point of this conversation? When you're making, well, I don't want to say advances, but you're taking direct shots at John, and some of these shots don't even have to do with John. Almost sounds like you wanted to continue writing a letter to Patsy, but then you just didn't continue writing the letter to Patsy. You just took a left turn somewhere. It's quite interesting. And so he invokes, calls John a fat cat, tells him he uses good common sense, and even sorts to make these indirect references that seem connected to Patsy's Southern background. And to me, I think these are really huge mixed signals that create several competing narratives or several competing centers of focus when it comes to the ransom note. First, you have John and Patsy as individuals. We're looking at John and Patsy, just them together. And then another focus of the note focuses on John as a personal target. That's number two. And then the third focus of the note is the United States as the alleged object of hostility. And then fourth, we have JonBenet as the victim. And so because those focal points never really settle into like a single coherent narrative that means anything that we can derive and say, what's the single point that's trying to be expressed here? They never come together. It's just a bunch of blob coming at you. And you're like, what's the point of all of this coming together? There's really no focus of this letter. The language feels sort of chaotic because there's no coherent narrative. And what makes this, I think, pattern interesting to me is that we see something similar begin to appear. If we keep watching, we see something similar begin to appear in John Ramsey's interviews over time. When he's discussing the case, he sometimes pivots maybe away from like specifics about JonBenet or some of the mechanics of the crime, and instead sort of moves to these more broader themes, such as, I'm sorry, such as how the public has betrayed him or treated he and Patsy terribly. These guys, they want to make themselves, victims so bad. How dare you? I'm appalled that you would ever ask me a question. You mistreated me. And we have an hour and a half worth of, woe is me from Patsy and woe is me from Patsy and John. And so they shift from what we really should be talking about to sort of how the public has treated he and Patsy, or this idea that someone may have been jealous of him personally. And they said, I think it was Barbara who asked, who would have been? He's like, I don't know. Somebody. Yeah, somebody. Because at the same time, the ransom note itself is claiming quite the opposite. And the ransom note is stating that the writer doesn't really have a problem with John. They said that explicitly. You're telling me this guy has a problem with you, and the letter is saying, I don't have a problem with you. I don't have a problem with you. It's like we got to slow down and step back and say, wait. John keeps on saying that John Douglas said that this person has a problem with him, and these people, if explicitly stopped and stated and said, John, we don't have a problem with you. It's not even where you work. It's the where you work for. But that also ties us to something, right? Because why do we have a problem in the direction of business? You can mention so many things. Why is business the thing that we're focusing on? A business, the country that we're focusing on. You could talk about how he loves to fly planes. You could talk about how he's getting into boating and sailboating and whatnot. You can get into him buying nice cars, spending all his time trying to fix up the his planes and stuff like that, and try to do maintenance on his planes. We could talk about those things, but you go specifically toward his job and then make this huge uncorrelated leap from his job to the country. So the contradiction, I think, when we think about how it addresses John and then jumps to the United States, that contradiction can leave investigators and observers with these multiple conflicting interpretive paths, sort of looking for someone who is angry at John is one of the things that we're looking for. Somebody who's mad, somebody who clearly can't stand John. We're looking for that person. Or we might be looking for someone who's acting out of anti-U.S. sentiment. Sentiment. Acting out of anti-U.S. sentiment, and or someone with intimate knowledge of the family. Right? Even elements like the phrase, and this is what got me, elements like the phrase SBTC victory introduce additional possibilities, such as connections to places like Subic Bay. Yet those possibilities also fail to align cleanly with the rest of the narrative. And so when we take this stuff together, the language in the note and the shifting emphasis in later interviews, it kind of creates a sense of rhetorical instability where the focus repeatedly moves from one center to another without clearly resolving around JonBenet or a single identifiable motive as to why JonBenet was tied up in this in the first place. If you got a problem with John, just wait on John. I mean, you have plenty of opportunities. If you have a problem with John, you have plenty of opportunities. And even that story does not make sense, because if you have a problem with John, you have plenty of opportunities to take John by himself, right? To go get JonBenet and involve JonBenet, and then to use the wood handle on JonBenet makes no sense, because you have no problem with JonBenet. Why would you go do all these crazy things to JonBenet? Why would you act in the way you do toward JonBenet? You don't have a problem with her. That doesn't make sense. Make it make sense. If I didn't have a problem with JonBenet, I would say to her, little girl, this is not about you. We're just taking you for this, that. How did she end up becoming the victim of an inappropriate behavioral crime? How? When you didn't even have a problem with her. And then somebody just says, you know what, while I have you here, let's go this direction. Who does that? I have a problem with John. I want John. So why go through these steps to where I have to babysit somebody and I really have a problem with John? It doesn't make sense. And even because I was thinking, I was like, even when we look at the Subic Bay Training Center idea, and they say, you know what, SBTC victory, that does not make sense. If we think about SBTC in terms of Subic Bay or Saved by the Cross or whatever else we're going to say, that has nothing to do with the country. Subic Bay Training Center is a connection to the country. That's about the only thing that would make sense. Now we can look at SBTC outside of the letter narrative and say Saved by the Cross or anything else. But if we look at the SBTC inside of the letter narrative and what we can connect it back to, it doesn't connect in the context of the country on an institutional political level, and it connects back to the U.S. Then it makes sense because John went to the military in the Philippines, and he was stationed in the Philippines at Subic Bay Training Center or whatever at Subic Bay, right? If we go that route and we look at that connection makes perfect sense. But it would tell us this person has something to do with the Philippines. This person either lived in the Philippines and engaged with John in the Philippines, or this person is from the Philippines and has come to the U.S., has waited their turn or their time, and has collected money or received an investment to travel to the U.S. and confront John for the horrible things that John has done as John was over in the Philippines training in the Navy. But the person has tracked John all the way to Atlanta and up to Colorado, so that the John that they know, they've never seen that John in the North. They've seen that John only in the South. They've seen that John in Atlanta, and then they see that John move to Colorado. And this person apparently is from the Philippines or has some sort of tie back to the Philippines, because you can't just say SBTC victory, because SBTC is where John was. That's a favorable look at John. SBTC victory would be what John would say. John would say SBTC victory because John was a part of SBTC. That's a U.S.-based organization. That's a U.S.-based training center where John would be stationed learning how to be a military officer. So SBTC cannot be a foreign faction because SBTC would have to be a U.S. faction. That does not make sense. What kind of criminal was this? Think about that. You would have to have some sort of anti-SBTC sentiment. Because if John is saying Subic Bay, because if you say that Subic Bay Training Center victory, John would be saying victory. What person would not like John, would not like the U.S., but also be at Subic Bay as well and would say victory, as if that would be to imply that there was some sort of overturn or overthrow that happened during John's time, or attempted coup during John's time in the Philippines that he's not discussed with us. We need to ask, hey, while you were in the Philippines at Subic Bay, did anybody have a problem with anything to where they felt like they needed to overthrow the training center and take, and basically keep you guys under siege? Anything like that? That might help us get an understanding, because that person, whoever it is, found some money with not only themselves and a couple other people, but they found themselves for money for themselves and a couple of other people to buy a plane to the U.S. and get a van and get surveillance equipment. Look, back in 1996, this stuff was not cheap. You're talking about somebody with some money behind them. To get some money behind them and then to travel, plane tickets are not going to be cheap. Then to travel to the U.S. from the Philippines, 4 people getting in a van and running that media equipment to monitor John and to monitor Patsy. Or if you're not in the States yet, you send somebody out to monitor John and bring back intel. But that's what the profile of this person would be. Somebody who is familiar with what John does as a job and doesn't like the U.S. And so they're gunning to combat the U.S. in some way by getting to John. So now we need to ask John, because apparently John is much more important than we initially realized, because if they're gunning for John, then they're saying John is super important to this case because of what he does for Lockheed Martin and because of what Lockheed Martin does for the United States. It has to be that. John is at that point more than a CEO. And that's the thing that we have to look into. John is now more than the CEO. So what does that mean now? This note is tripping over its own shoelaces, because this note can't even get regular criminal language down. It's like language coming from an elementary school kid. They just sat down with a piece of paper and start writing stuff that does not make sense because there's no clear direction for what they want. And my concern is when you hear John talking, and I'm gonna keep on going with this at a later time, but when you keep on talking to John and allowing John to talk to you, you kind of see like, John, you really don't have a point to what you're saying. And you might start some things that are wildly suspicious, but then go a different direction. That's kind of interesting to me. I'm not really sure I understand it. But let me know what you think. Like, share, subscribe, comment, whatever below. And until next time, take care of yourself.